Proverbs chapter 4, starting in verses 20 through 24. And this is what it says: My son, give attention to my words, incline your ear to my sayings. Do not let them depart from your eyes. Keep them in the midst of your heart. For they are life to those who find them, and health to all their flesh. Keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it springs the issues of life. Put away from you a deceitful mouth, and put perverse lips far from you. Let your eyes look straight ahead, and your eyelids look right before you. Ponder the path of your feet, and let all your ways be established. Do not turn to the right or to the left. Remove your foot from evil. According to Oxford University researchers, they have just recently found in 2016, after doing many years of study, that 16 days after conception, a tiny electrical pulse stimulates your heart muscle, and it causes your left and right atria to contract. And on that 16th day after conception, your heart starts beating. It's called an atrial kick, and it's the first heartbeat. And previously, before this, it was believed that it actually happened on the third week, on the 22nd day. It's so slight and so small that it's taken them this long to actually come to that point where they understand that the heartbeat starts on the 16th day of conception. Wow. During that same research, they filmed the video, and I just want to show, it's just a 35-second clip, and if you'll just put that up.
Note how the heart changes colour as blood enters and leaves its chambers with each beat. The heart will beat approximately 54 million times before birth and over 3.2 billion times over the course of an 80-year lifespan.
Wow. Your heart will beat 3.2 billion times over an 80-year lifespan. That's just difficult to fathom, to know that your heart is constantly beating. And this is, they say that 100,000 times your heart beats in a day. Except for that one time where you met that significant other and your heart skipped a beat, you know? And if you reach over right now and touch the hand of your significant other, I'm sure that your heart will skip a beat again. What was that, John? You're on the... Oh, come on now. No. Even researchers understand that your heart has a lot of significance, and even in the ancient cultures, the heart was a significant organ to understand. And for us today, we don't quite get it because we think that everything, during Valentine's Day or during our anniversary, we talk about, I love you with all of my heart. But actually in ancient culture, they believed that the seat of your emotions, where love would come from, was actually in your gut, in your kidneys area, in your stomach area. And that's where, when you say you have butterflies in your stomach, it's really those emotions, that stressors and different emotional reactions that you have cause butterflies in your stomach. Now, if you have butterflies in your heart, you better get yourself to the hospital because you're having a heart attack. So we understand that the heart was not necessarily the seat of our emotions. Rather, it was thought of actually as the central processing unit for everything. It's where we took the information that we got here in the head, processed it, and it was the seat of our will and our desire. And so everything that you learned up here would eventually come into your heart. Your heart would process it. The gut was where you felt like that gut, that instinct. You would either react out of your heart. So your reactions were the external manifestation of what was going on the inside. So the heart was all about what was going on the inside of you. And it controlled what you would exhibit through your outward actions. And so, as we all understand today, we've all dealt with different things, stressors in our life, different things that have taken place in our life that have caused us to look at circumstances and to internalize circumstances and react in one way or another based on everything that we've processed and now gets filtered into our heart, and we react accordingly. And that's why when the wisdom of Solomon, when he writes these passages, he says, we ought to be careful, guard your heart, for out of it flows the wellspring of life. He says, watch what comes into your heart. Watch what is processed on that internal processing unit of your life, on the internal things. Why? Because we can have a lot of manifestations on the outside that really don't show what we feel on the inside. We could go through the motions. We can have an external. You can't really tell what's going on the inside based on what's going on the outside all the time. That's why even today, if you talk to a cardiologist and they want to check your heart, they put you through a battery of tests. They don't say, here's the test to test your heart. What do they say? Here are the tests that I'm going to send you to. You have an angiogram, you got an EKG, you've got a MRI, you've got all these tests. You've got the stress test, you've got the blood pressure readings. They have to examine it through a variety of different ways of examining your heart. There's not just one way to say that your heart is good. You can't just take your blood pressure and say, well, my heart is good. Why? Because they don't know what's flowing in and out of your heart through your blood pressure. They just know that something's not right or something is doing okay, but there may be another problem somewhere else. And so they go through all these battery of tests to find out what's going on in your heart. And I think that's a perfect example, even for us as believers, of us measuring what's going on in our heart. You can't just say, well, I read the Bible every day, and so that's my litmus test of whether or not everything is good in my life spiritually. No, there's a battery of tests. There's a lot of other things that you've got to go through to understand where you stand internally in your heart. There are many ways to examine what's going on in your heart and to understand the seed of this processing of your desires, your wants, and even of your habits on a day-to-day basis. The heart is a central theme all throughout Scripture. Why? Because the heart is more than just that. It is more than just an emotional response. It is about where we stand with the Lord. What goes on in our heart measures where we stand with God. It is that control center. And how we behave is just an external manifestation of the internal checking of our heart. That's why when we as parents say, well, you need to just behave. Can I ask you something? If you're telling somebody to behave, are you telling them to change what they're doing, or are you telling them to change how they're thinking and how they're processing? Because at about age 4, we all go through this change in our body. At about age 4, you start, rather than looking at and answering, you start asking questions when you're a toddler, 2, 3, 4 years old. Why? Something along the line. At 4, you change, your mentality changes, and you stop asking why as much, and you start actually looking and thinking and processing. And around 13, 14 years old, you move from looking, thinking, and processing to knowing, even though you don't know. Exactly. And we shift from this excited love of learning to this to this change of ourselves where we now have to play a part. And we change on the outside and we react to things on the outside based on what we think somebody is going to like or dislike. And it's not necessarily changing the inside of us, it's changing the external. So if you give a list of do's and don'ts, and you see our children go through this even in their own life, in their own lifespan, they go through the do's and don'ts. This is what you ought to do. This is what you ought to do. And then, but if we don't ever get engaged their heart in understanding why it is why we do what we do. They will go through the motions and eventually they'll test the boundaries. And when they test the boundaries and they're able to push the boundaries further, they will continue to push the boundaries further. Why? Because it didn't start in the heart. It didn't start with that understanding that there was something that had to take place on the inside. There's a mountain called Fairweather Mountain. It's one of the most spectacular mountains in North America. It's located just southeast of Alaska. The mountain reaches 15,000 feet above sea level. It has massive granite walls with deep ravines cut by cascading glaciers. And it creates this inspiring view. It's a beautiful place, Fairweather Mountain. But the mountain is called Fairweather because you can only see its full glory and the beauty of the mountain when the fog clears. And author John Eldridge uses Fairweather Mountain as an illustration to describe how most people live their lives. And he says this: much of our confusion results from a failure to understand the truth proclaimed in Proverbs 4, verse 23, and other scriptures that describe the significance of the heart. And he says, in this brief passage, the wise King Solomon identified 4 principles for guarding your heart. And he goes on to say, you must recognize your treasure. You must prioritize your task. You must minimize the trash. And you must energize the truth. That's kind of what I want to talk about today. He says, you can only see the glory of this mountain. Actually, you can only see it for 20 days a year. We went to, this week, we went to Cumberland Falls in Kentucky. And it's a beautiful place there. They've got the fall. They call it the Niagara of the South. I don't think it's anything nowhere near as big as Niagara, but it's beautiful. One of the things about that place, though, it's one of the only places on the Western Hemisphere where you can actually see what is called a moonbow. It only happens on a full moon 3 times every month. So you can only go there 3 times every month to see this beautiful thing called the moonbow. It's where the moon reflects off of the falls and it creates a rainbow at night. But you can't see it any other time. It wasn't going to happen on the day that we were there. And there's just that idea that sometimes you don't catch the beauty of something because of timing, because of when you're there, and what is allowed to be seen when you're there, when you're present. You know, what we allow to be seen in our hearts, how often do we reveal it to other people? And it's not good for us to reveal everything to everyone. Can I just be completely honest with you? I really don't want to know all of your trash. But I do know that there is a God in heaven who does understand and know everything that goes on in your life. And there are times when he allows you to reveal some of those things to certain people in your life to hold you accountable for what's going on in your life. And so this idea, or what we're going to talk about over the next few weeks, is that this idea of examining the heart, guarding the heart, and allowing the heart to produce in you what God desired it to produce in you. He has a plan and a purpose for your life, and he wants to produce something that is beautiful inside of you. Max Lucado gives a quick little illustration concerning this. He says, some years ago, I underwent a heart procedure. My heart had the regularity of a telegraph operator sending Morse code. Fast, 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 slow. After several failed attempts to restore a healthy rhythm with medication, the doctor decided that I should have a catheter ablation. The plan went like this. A cardiologist would insert 2 cables in my heart via a blood vessel. One was a camera. The other was an ablation tool. To ablate is to burn. Yes, burn or cauterize, singe, brand. If all went well, the doctor, to use his coinage, would destroy the misbehaving part of my heart. He would cut out, or he would cauterize the misbehaving part of my heart. As I was being wheeled into surgery, he asked if I had any final questions. Not the best choice of words. I was trying to be witty. He says, "You're burning the interior of my heart, right?" "Correct," he responded. "You intend to kill the misbehaving cells?" "Yes, that's my plan." "As long as you're in there, could you also take your little blowtorch to some of my greed, my selfishness, my superiority, and my guilt?" He smiled and he answered, "Sorry, that's out of my pay grade." "Indeed it was," he writes, "but it's not out of God's. He's in the business of changing our hearts." God is in the business of changing our hearts. When Solomon writes this, I like what he says here. He starts out this passage by saying this in verse 20. He says, "My son, give attention to my words and incline your ear to my sayings." If we really want to understand the heart of God, if we want to change our hearts to be more like God's heart, if we want to cauterize the bad areas of our hearts, then we must first learn to incline our ears to his voice. How do I do that in today's society? How do I cauterize the evil influences, those things that are constantly speaking at me, those circumstances in my life that brought me to a place where I'm hurting, the guilt and the pain of maybe past abuse, or maybe there were words that have been spoken over you that injured your heart, that they broke you down, they made you less than what you thought you could be. How do I then cauterize those areas in my life and allow God to work healing in me? He says, incline your ears to my words. Why? Because when God speaks, what he speaks is a restorative word. He speaks a word of healing. Listen, if you will get into his word, yes, there's a lot of things in his word that hurt. But I want to tell you, if it hurts, it's because it's working. Nothing that is going to bring health in your life doesn't come without some level of pain and hurt. It will cause hurt so that it can heal. The way that you build muscle is first by destroying muscle. The way that you build strength is by first becoming weak in order to become strong. We all go through the pain of having to go through things, and especially if you've been injured. Now, many of you here, y'all can understand, because I can say almost every one of you here that I know of has gone through some level of physical therapy. I myself included. And I can tell you, it does not feel good to go through physical therapy. Amen. I should have heard a loud amen on that one. Going through physical therapy does not feel good, but I can tell you this. If you don't go through physical therapy, what will happen is that your muscles will seize up. Your body will start to shut down. But when you go through that physical therapy, your muscles become pliable, flexible, stronger. And through that pain, you are able to quicken the healing process. So he says, incline your ears to my words. Hear what I'm about to say. That's the first thing I want to remind you today. We have got to listen to God's word. We've got to get into a place where we hear his words and we pay attention to his sayings. Because there's a lot of voices that are speaking into your life. There are a lot of voices that are constantly penetrating this mind that gets into this heart. Remember, it starts here, but it's processed here. That's why some of us, when we hear somebody say something, many times when we take it to heart, you know the saying, taking it to heart, right? We take it to heart. We may not hear what they're truly saying because we may have been injured in a way. We may have been abused in a way. Things may have been said. So when we hear those words, it triggers something inside of us that gets processed in our heart, and we take it to heart in the negative way. That just means that we need greater healing. That God's not done healing our hearts. And we all go through that. We all face that at one point or another. Whether it's in our marriage, whether it's with a family, whether it's with a family member where things have not gone right, whether it's with a sibling, whatever, maybe it's with a coworker, whatever it may be, we all go through times in our life where the things that are being processed through this mind get into our heart and it produces something contrary to what the initial message was. Because we filtered it through a broken heart. So he says, hear my words. My words. Incline your ear to my voice. His voice is the only voice that will bring healing. And then he says, do not let them depart from your eyes. Keep them in the midst of your heart. I like that. He says, do not let them depart from your eyes. Why? Why is he saying that? Why does he say that? He says that because it's something that you've got to constantly be in. You have got to see and read and hear his voice. Don't let it get far from your eyesight. Don't let it get past that way, that entrance gate into your processing. His word has got to be at the forefront of your sight and of all of your senses. He says, for they are life to those who find them, and health to all of their flesh. Wow. Jesus declared that we should love the Lord our God with all of our heart, with all of our mind, with all of our soul, with all of our strength in Mark 12:30. So when describing the kingdom of God, Jesus revealed the things that come out of the heart, and he says that those things are what defiles a man in Matthew chapter 15. He also taught, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The Apostle Paul prayed for the saints that the eyes of the heart might be enlightened. We find similar instructions all throughout the Old Testament, where we're commanded to trust the Lord with all of our hearts. See, the heart is a mysterious spiritual reality that allows us to experience the fullness of life. It includes our emotion, but the heart is not limited to the emotion. The heart can be grieved, it can be troubled, it can be broken, it can be pierced, it can be divided, and it can be joyful. So we've got to learn how to hear God's voice, how to recognize the treasure that is in his word to bring healing to our hearts. We've got to prioritize the task of guarding our heart. If I asked you today, what spiritual discipline do you need to work on? Where would guarding your heart be? For far too long as believers, we say, well, the most important spiritual discipline is prayer. And listen, that's not to say that prayer is any lower. I think prayer needs to be there. But at the same time, we've got to guard our hearts. Why? Because when I go to prayer sometimes, and my heart's not where it needs to be, what happens? Either you fall asleep in prayer, or your mind wanders in prayer, or your prayers become so self-centered and so selfish that it actually doesn't do any good for you. You wind up leaving that prayer feeling almost as bad as when you entered into that time of prayer. He says, guard your hearts. This is important for us to prioritize guarding our hearts because guarding our hearts is not a substitution for anything else. You've got to add that to the equation of times of prayer, times of reading His Word, times of worshiping. You got to guard your heart when you worship. Why? Because there are times when I worship, and what is worship? You know what worship is. It's ascribing worth to something. That when we get into a time of worship, and worship is not just singing songs, but I'll use this as an example. When we enter into the quote-unquote worship service, when we're singing songs, that we get so comfortable with the words that we just mutter the words because it's a song that we already know. And it means nothing to us when we say the words. How often do we find ourselves doing that? How often do we find ourselves just saying the words of the song that we're singing? Oh, I know that lyric. Jenny and I played that game the other day. We started a song, and in the first 10 seconds, she's like, I know that song. She'll tell exactly what song that is. Why? Because she knows the music. She knows the words. But are the words doing anything? Do the words have any impact? It's important for us to understand that. When we guard our hearts, we've got to guard our hearts in our times of worship, in our times of intercession, in our times of devotion. We've got to put a priority on His Word. He says, keep your hearts with all diligence, because out of it is the wellspring of life, springs the issues of life. Listen, we've got to come to a place where we minimize the trash that comes into our hearts. We've got to minimize the trash that comes into our hearts. Be careful what you allow into your heart. Like I said before, the heart it is a place where emotions do happen. But the heart is also the place where your desires and your will are engaged. And depending on the message that you're placing into this mind and filtered into this heart, will eventually cause you to deviate from the desire and the will of God in your life. So he says, guard your heart with all diligence. Because out of it comes that wellspring, the issues of life, everyday interactions. You know, sometimes we get into arguments with our spouse because of what's going on in our heart. We get into issues with our children because of what's going on in our heart. Sometimes we even, and we sound crazy sometimes as parents, I can't believe you, blah, 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 blah. And we're laying it down on our kids and they're looking at us like, what are you talking about? That was like so 20 minutes ago. But it was festering in our hearts. Y'all understand what I'm talking about here. Parents, y'all know what I'm talking about. Kids, y'all know what we're talking about. You're like, where was that? Where were you 30 minutes ago? That was so yesterday. But it was festering in our hearts, and we get into, and it gets in us. And if we're not careful, the thoughts, the words, the things that we allow to come into our hearts, it will create opportunities for the devil to challenge the way that we think of things. He will pervert the thoughts and the intentions of our heart. So the verses that follow the command to guard our hearts describe putting away perverse speech, looking straight ahead, and choosing good paths. Look what he says. Verse 24, put away from you a deceitful mouth, and put perverse lips far from you, and let your eyes look straight ahead, and your eyelids look right before you. He says, be careful with what you allow to filter into your heart. Be careful with the things that you say and the things that you do, because those things will create issues with your spiritual being, with your heart. Therefore, look at what he says in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 2. He says, therefore, since we also have such a high cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that so easily entangles us, and run with endurance the race that lies before us, keeping our eyes on who? Jesus, the source, the perfecter, the author, and the perfecter of our faith. Both of these passages reveal the need to remove the things from our lives that would cause a hindrance to us running the race of our life. We've got to be careful with what we allow to be processed through this heart. And we got to be careful, too, that we don't take it to extremes. Because another extreme would be legalism. And if we allow legalism to ensnare our hearts, we remove the goal line of what it means to live the Christian life. And we remove the goal line of living the Christian life and replace it with religious action. What God desires from us is relationship. Legalism requires from us action. And while there is a level of action and engagement that God requires from us, listen, His priority for us is relationship. It's not action. And that's why He says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. He doesn't say you attain salvation through fear, through working out your salvation with fear and trembling. He says, no, work out your salvation. He doesn't say salvation is attained through your works. I read this recently. It was Andy Stanley. He wrote a book, and in the book he writes about this guy named Brian. And Brian had gone to his cardiologist. Brian was having some issues. He was getting winded when he would do any kind of activity. After about 10, 20 minutes, he'd start sweating. He'd get winded. He'd feel like I feel sometimes after preaching. So he would get winded. So he went to his cardiologist, and he asked the cardiologist, hey, what's going on? He goes, let me do a series of tests. So the cardiologist comes back after doing a series of tests with Brian, comes back for his follow-up. And he says, I've got some good and I've got some bad news. He goes, the good news is that you don't have to have any surgery, but at the same time, he goes, if I were to scale you from a level of 1 to 10, I would put you at a 7. He says, there are some immediate things that you need to start working on. And so he gives him a list, and he says, I need you to follow this regimen. And on the regimen, it was that he was to work out 3 times a week for about 30 minutes. Well, Brian looks at his cardiologist, and he says, if I could work out for 30 minutes 3 times a week, I wouldn't be coming to you. The problem is that I can't work out for more than 10 minutes if I get winded. And the cardiologist looks at him and he says, Brian, you've got to start small. If you can start small, you will build up the strength in your muscles so that eventually your heart can get to the place where it can handle more than 30 minutes of exercise. And Brian's like, well, no, I can't do that. There's just no way I can do that. And he said, well, what else can I do? He goes, well, you need to also lose weight. And he said, I can't lose weight because then I would have to start working out. He goes, there's no way I can work out because I can't last for 10 minutes. And he goes, and the cardiologist said, start out small. Start out by cutting out some of cutting out your diet, being careful what you put into your body. Your body will process that. It will get into your heart. You will build up plaque, which is what has been causing you to slow down. If you will just start small, you can do this. And Brian was like, I can't do this. There's no way. If you could just fix me first, then I can get to that place. And the doctor says, Brian, you're an idiot. No, he didn't say you were an idiot. But he wanted to tell him that, is what Andy Stanley writes. He goes, he wanted to tell him that, but of course, doctors can't say that. You have first got to work on your issues in order to get to the place where healing can start. If you will change your habits, eventually your habits will change you. If you'll start with a good habit, replace the bad habit with a good habit, healing will start. If we can change some of the things that we are doing, the way that we do things, the way that we interact, and replace the those issues, those trash portions, the things that we look at, the things that we listen to, the things that we hear, the things that we consume, if we can change some of those external things that are affecting the internal person, listen, you say, well, I don't understand why I'm dealing with this. I don't understand why I'm dealing with this. I don't understand why I'm dealing with this. If you will change your habits, other things will start to fall into place and healing will begin. Which brings me to being energized by truth. For a strategy for guarding your heart is to listen to what God is saying. And we live in a world that is often opposed to truth. Our culture promotes tolerance over truth. But the wise king reminds us that there is a difference between right and wrong, good and bad, righteous and evil. Level paths that have a solid foundation lead to success. But evil and unstable choices will lead us to destruction. It says, if you will follow my truth, he says, ponder the path of your feet. Ponder the path of your feet. And let all your ways be what? Established. You know what that means, right? It means that it's foundational. That you know what it means to stand where you stand. We live in a culture where reality and truth shifts from day to day, from person to person, from situation to situation. It's so bad that they actually call it situational ethics. Can you believe that? Anybody here who's gone to college understands what I'm talking about. They talk about situational ethics. And I kept on bringing up, what about moral absolutes? Well, morality has to do with a system of religious thought. I want to tell you, absolutes are absolutes. And if you keep telling me about situational ethics, then what we'll see is what we have seen. You want to know why our stock market crashed and has crashed and will continue, and why we will see it again is because people's hearts have not changed. It's because the people are greed. Greed has driven our society. Is investing bad? No, not at all. Actually, as a matter of fact, the Bible gives us illustration upon illustration that we ought to invest for the future, that we ought to have a solid foundation of being diligent to sow so that we can reap a harvest. The problem is where greed of man comes in. When they repackaged those mortgages and sold them, knowing that they were junk mortgages. We had the crash that we had. See, this is where we stand today. And the Bible says that we got to be careful what flows through this heart. Are you making decisions based on what you can accumulate? Or are you making your decisions based on what you can give for the cause of Christ? Give for your future and your family and your neighbor. To be faithful and do what God has called you to do. Or are you making choices out of greed? Out of selfishness? Out of, I'll get you for that. You know, that retribution mindset that sometimes we get into. We got to be careful why we make the decisions that we're doing and make sure that we are established in everything that we do. So he says, do not turn to the right or to the left, but remove your foot. Listen. This is what he's been saying. You got 1 foot here, and you got 1 foot here. He says, this is the life that you live. And he knows us. Wow. Does he ever know us? Does God know us? Absolutely. He knows that we've got 1 foot here. That we are just like my son, pushing the envelope. We are just like, he is my son. And when I say that, I take it, I tell you, he is just like me. Why? Because I've done it and I do it. I push the envelope. I step one foot right here and say, well, it's a gray area. How many of you have heard that saying? It's not really that bad, but listen to what God says. He says, take your foot out of that evil. It was just a gray area, God. No. A gray area is still evil. He says, take your foot out of out of evil and set yourself firmly on foundation. The foundation of my word. The foundation of my truth. That will change this heart. With every eye closed and every head bowed. Father, I thank you today. I thank you because as we've started to talk a little bit about issues of the heart, I just pray, Father, that you would challenge us, that we would guard our hearts. The desire that you have for us today is that we be careful where we stand. And Father, we can spot those areas in other people's life, but Father, I just ask today that I would be willing to examine where I stand today. Not be so focused on where somebody else stands, but seeing where I'm pushing the envelope, where I'm stepping into gray areas, where my heart isn't guarded. Father, forgive me for the times that I have stepped out of bounds. Wash my heart, cleanse me, purify me. Father, may the things that have affected the way that my heart processes, the words that have been spoken, the animosity that has been shown towards, the things that have injured this heart, that cause it to process in a negative way, I pray for healing.